Okay, so it's the top of the hour, and I welcome everybody to this second ALPO webinar. We're trying to do something new here. So at any rate, I wanted to start off by going over a few housekeeping items before I turn it over to Gary. And let's see if I can get there we go. So as you can just see, we are going to be recording this for publication to our ALPO YouTube home. So this video will be out there in a few days, probably. I'm relying on Tim Robertson to post it, and I know he is away at the moment. So it could be a couple weeks before this gets posted, but rest assured that it will be posted to our little niche out there on YouTube. And the good thing about that is that if Gary does something and you miss it, or he did something a little too fast, no worries. You can always then go back and play it on YouTube as many times as you need in order to see what it was that he did. The other thing is we're going to ask for this presentation that you hold your questions until the end, because that'll facilitate Gary's presentation here. So I'm hoping there will be questions, and if so, you've got a couple ways you can either grab a Post-it note or a little piece of paper and jot down your question so that when we ask for questions at the end, you can bring it up and remember what it was that you wanted to ask. The other thing that you could do as an option would be to go ahead and key it into the chat. And then later, again, we'll go back and look at the chat items to see whether anybody has asked questions in there, which then Gary can go back and address. And then finally, I'll mention that at the end of the presentation here, later this afternoon or this evening, you'll get an email from me with a link to a survey. It's a brief survey. It's 10 questions. Nothing very complex, should take you a couple minutes to do. But I would appreciate your feedback so that we can get a sense in terms of, whether this is something good that the ALPO is doing, whether maybe some ideas in terms of topics that you would like to see. So when you get that email from me with a link to the survey, if you can take a couple minutes to fill that out, I would be most appreciative. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing. And Gary, I'm going to turn it over to you so that you can hopefully share.
Okay, let's see. There we go. You should see a silhouette reflector on my home screen here with our subject Jupiter shining through the lower part of the opening here. I wish I could say that was my imaging telescope, but I'm afraid it's not. Thank you for asking me to do this. I guess I must be doing something right to be asked by the ALPO to make this presentation. And I'm certainly willing and glad to share the way I've been doing things lately, and hopefully you can pick up some tips from that, or maybe you can teach me something as we go along. I will say that over the past couple of years, I have been trying to incorporate a lot of the techniques from Damian Peach's excellent video tutorial series. And if you have looked at those, you'll probably recognize some of the things I'm doing. And if you haven't, I would highly recommend them. They're very detailed and excellent. So having said that, let's see if we can have a look here. I picked an image process for you from back on the 17th of December. This was a little bit after Jupiter's opposition. And the planet was still fairly large at that point. It's 48 arc seconds, so it's big enough to show us some good details, and also the seeing was good that night. Now, Jim had asked me to show a photo of the equipment, and we'll just briefly go over this since the object here is to go over the processing, but you sort of need to see where the images came from. I use a 10-inch Maksutov telescope. It's f14.5 native, and I have a feather touch motorized focuser here on the back of it. And then I have a 2.5x PowerMate attached to that. Then the filter wheel, motorized filter wheel. And currently I'm using a monochrome camera. It's a QHY 200M. This is a very sensitive camera with about 3.6 micron pixels. And with this setup, I get an imaging scale of right at 1/10 of an arc second per pixel. And that seems to be more than enough for the 10-inch. So what I do, I take repetitive RGB sets over about an hour, hour and a half in an observing session. Each video is about 60 seconds in length, and my exposure time is 10 milliseconds. So I get almost 6,000 frames per filter. Now, after I've accumulated the videos, I run all of the videos through Autostakkert. Now this is this is the version 3, but the functions are the same in the version 4 if you're using the newest one. You can see I've got one of the videos of Jupiter loaded here. This is a red filtered video. The usual settings over here. What I like to do first is go through and stack a relatively small number, say a third of the frames. Here it's 2,000. And I'm going to click this box where it says sharpen. If you click this box, in addition to the raw stack, Autostakkert outputs a sharpened version. And then I can go back and examine those sharpened versions of the image in order to pick out which videos I want to further process and combine into my final color image. So that way I can select the best, hopefully select or find a series of good images over, say, 10 minutes to even a half an hour. And what I'll do is try to pick out the sharpest images during that interval, the sharpest red ones, the sharpest green ones, and the sharpest blue ones. And we can just take a quick look at those. Let's take a blue one here. You see, this is the raw stack on the left, and then the sharpened image on the right. So this way I can tell which images are the best for the night. And like, for instance, on this night, we look a little bit further down in the session. So down around here, maybe about 20, 30 minutes later, see the seeing had significantly decreased. So I throw away these guys and I keep these guys over here. So now on this particular night, I was able to identify a sequence of 5 red, green, and blue images over a period of 16 minutes. So the V-rotation time will be 16 minutes for this image. And after I've identified the ones I want to use, I usually go back into Autostakkert again and look at their try to evaluate the quality of the images and decide how many I want to stack. You can just go on here and look through your video, and it sort of starts to significantly deteriorate. And I usually stack anywhere from about 2,000 to 3,000 images, about a third to a half, depending upon the how good or how stable the seeing was that particular evening. So as I said, I identified a series of 5 here to work with. Now, the next my next step is going to be wavelet sharpening, which I do in Registax, and we need to take a look at that. I've taken a fairly routine approach to it at this stage. And this is one of the red images here. And I have some schemes that I've saved. And I use them practically for every session. I don't, at this point in processing the image, I don't vary too much on the wavelet settings. So I use the linear default method, initial layer 1 and step 0. And most of my detail is revealed in the number 2 slider. So you can see this is set at 90%. And so that's what I do for the red image. Now let's take a look at a green image. And we'll reset and load the green scheme. So here's a green. It's pretty much similar to the red, a little stronger, 95%. Then I'm starting to feed in some of the number 3 slider here up to about 5%. And so let's now look at a blue one. I'll load the blue scheme. And here I've gone up to 100% on number 2 and 10% on number 3. It's a good idea to usually start feeding in some of the number 3 slider for the green and the blue images, because they need to be, the contrast on those needs to be boosted relative to the red. And especially when the seeing is average or poor, I'll sometimes pull number 3 up to 15 or 20% here. And that helps out in the final image. So now, since I use a mono camera, I have to construct my color image. And I use the program WinJupos to do that. I find it's an extremely powerful program, and once you get the hang of it, it goes pretty quickly. So we don't have time to really go through actually measuring and so forth, but I did just load an example here of one of the blue images from this sequence. The most important thing here is in the imaging module is to set this profile correctly, because that's going to determine how all your other images are derotated. And so you can move this, you can change the size of it with and move it around and so forth. And the idea is to get it perfectly aligned across the equator and around the limb. So now I take all of my wavelet sharpened images and measure them. And once you get this set up for the first one, the rest of it goes fairly quickly. And then once I've measured them all, then I go to the derotation of images function here, and simply what this does, it saves a measurement file for each image. And so you load all those measurement files in. So I would load all 5 of the red ones here, and this derotates them into a single stack. Then I do the same thing for the blue ones and the green ones. And then once I have those RGB master stacks, go to derotation of RGB frames and load the red, the green, and the blue. And then that will output the color image for me. And you can have the orientation with north at the top or south at the top or whatever. And it comes out oriented correctly based on your measurements. So let's just take a look at the result of that. Now, let's see. Here are the master red, green, and blue. Each of these is over 12,000 frames now.
And just to orient us, you're in Photoshop, right?
Yes, I am. We're going to be in Photoshop most of the time, and I'll try to let you know when we're not. By the way, this is an older version of Photoshop PS4, but it does what I need it to do, and I think everything I'm going to show you is certainly in the latest version. Then just to show you the power of this derotation, it really adds a lot of images. Here's one of the sharpen stacks. So this one's just 2,500 images. This one's over 12,000. And you can readily see the reduction in the noise level in this. This is the 2,500, and that's the master stack, over 12,000 images here. So these three get put together into the color image, which we have here. And what I like to do, so what I'm going to do next is to further sharpen this image. But before I do that, I like to clean up the background a little bit here. One of these, sometimes they have these lines in here from the processing. I just take the eraser tool and get rid of the stuff. Some of these will interfere with one of the tools I'm going to use in Photoshop. So I don't want these sharp lines in here. So we just get rid of those. The wild mouse doesn't get away from me here. Then I like to set the background under levels at this point. And to do that, just pick this ink dropper here and put it on the background right outside the limb, and it darkens the background and adjusts the histogram here, as you see. So once I've done that, I save this image, and I found that color balancing the image worked well for me at this stage. That's it. Let's see. Nope. Let's see. Can't do it that way. Let me just show you the results of this. What I'm doing is just putting it in the RGB balance function here, right there. Just load the image and put RGB balance. And I'll show you the result here. Something's out of whack. I can't seem to bring it up like I thought I could, but anyway. This is the color balanced image. So this was the original, and then this has just been, the only thing that's been done to this, it was color balanced in Registax. So this gives me a common place to start from with the color. I don't do a lot of manipulation to the color. I pretty much leave it the way it comes out here. I found that to be more reproducible from one session to another and so forth. So now from here to finish the image, I'm going to go through a few steps of further sharpening. And now what I want to do is to sharpen the part of the planet that has the details on it and not the limb. If I sharpen the limb anymore, it's going to get artifactual looking. There's a nifty tool you can use here called the the magic wand tool, right here. And the settings up here in the corner, you want the fourth scheme. It's got like 4 different ways that it works. And then you just simply click, and it outlines the limb of the planet, like so. Now, just say select, modify, and we'll expand it. And about 12 pixels is a good expansion on this one, and that brings the selection circle just inside the limb, not really onto the detail much. Now next I'm going to feather it. I want to feather that and find that about 4 pixels works good for that. Now this tool is operating on what's outside the circle. So we want to work on what's in the circle. So we have to select inverse. And then we simply just copy it and paste it onto a new layer. That, so now we'll just be operating on what's inside the limb. Now, from here on, I use a stepwise approach with unsharp masking to further enhance the details in the image. And this one's fairly detailed, and so I'll show you a couple of different masks. So we come down sharpen, unsharpen mask. Now for this particular one, I chose a radius of 2.8, usually something between 2.5 to 3. This is what I call my coarse unsharp mask. And I apply it first off, and this particular image is pretty good, so I didn't want to do too much more, so only 30% here. You see, you can experiment with this. If the seeing had only been average, then I find up to 100% at this point. So now I'm going to go to another unsharp mask, and just in an attempt to sharpen the fine details. And so we'll go from 2.8 to something, say, less than 1 for a pixel radius. And we're really going to jack this percentage up to 250%. And the idea here is to sharpen the fine detail. Now, there's before and here's after. And if you look at some of these fine details up here, you can see the effect. Now, what also happens when you apply this is that you increase the noise background, especially with this fine filter. So there are a number of ways to approach that, but at this point, I'm just going to simply apply a despeckle to it. And since we have a fair number of images stacked here, this is like, I guess, over 40,000 total images. We can be a little more aggressive with the sharpening. Some images I can't, but this one I think will stand another unsharp mask. But this time I'll go down to maybe 100%. And here again, you just play around with this, and when it starts to look obviously overcooked, then you back off. But here we're seeing, nice detail up here in the zones and so forth. And so let's do that. Now I'm going to have to address the noise one more time. So another good denoise tool is Topaz. I've got version 5. There's some newer ones now that apparently use artificial intelligence, and I'm told that you don't want those. So I'm still using number 5. And for this particular image, we'll just maybe about a 0.3, and you can click back and forth here. And I just want to make sure the zones look nice and smooth and there's not any obvious noise at this point. So click OK. So this is basically all the sharpening I'm going to apply to this particular image. I think to go beyond this would be too much. So at this point, we're done with our mask, and so we'll just go up here to the layer and merge the layers. Now, there's a few things we can do to what I call final touches. This is a little pale, so let's put some increased saturation into it. So down to hue and saturation, and I find I jack mine up about 20%. Seems to be about right. A little more color into the belts and so forth. Now, I told you before I was done with sharpening. There is one more little tweak that I sometimes apply to the image, and this image was able to to stand that pretty well. You can take the lasso tool here and just go around areas in the image that have detail. And you can also exclude the limb again. And then you just take that and you feather this about maybe 3. And then you can apply some sort of a very mild sharpening filter to that, just to tweak those small details. And sometimes the sharpen filter works well. And that's what I actually used on this image. You can see the difference. Now, if the seeing were not good, or if I notice any artifact in that sharpen filter, then another filter you can use is the smart sharpen. It works a lot like the unsharp mask. So you can set the radius, you can set the pixel radius, and then I set the amount very low so that I can, so I don't overdo it. So I just put a little bit, 10% there, maybe even 5%. Some images you can do it twice, but it's sort of a stepwise approach rather than trying to do everything at once. So then once I've done that, I just deselect it. And the same thing here with the NEB. Just come around that like that, maybe include some of this detail in the zone there, feather, and then filter and sharpen. Select. Same thing here. This is getting a little tight down here. Now the idea here is sort of to stay out of the zones because you don't really need to sharpen any fine detail. There isn't any fine detail in the zones to speak of, so I'm just trying to avoid the zones. You can almost put this in one, just do this in one big swoop, but we'll just come around here and grab the ovals and so forth down here. Now, this is indeed the end of the sharpening. I wouldn't try to do anything else, but you can see how it sharpened up some of these small spots up here. Pointer. The ovals stand out. There's even some detail in the center of this oval. A little bit of detail in the red spot. One other, I'll show you one other individual. I don't think I did it on this image, but if you want to sharpen selective spots, you can take this sharpening tool over here and then again, with it set very low, you can just individually tweak these things, two or three clicks, if you want to try to sort of enhance the ovals or some sort of spot. An interesting area right there. So, you know, that's all the sharpening I would apply. Now, I want to make sure there's no noise, residual noise in it. And one way to look for that, just zoom it, and you can kind of see that there may be a little extra noise here in these areas that we sharpened. So another denoise tool that works pretty well is the reduce noise. And here it's just the basic one set to 10. And sometimes it's kind of hard, you know, it's just about right. You can tell it made a difference there. Some of this is kind of subtle and it helps to zoom in on it. So let's say okay, and then go back to here. Now, the rest of it's just sort of window dressing. This is the basic, almost finished image. One thing you can do to enhance the appearance of your images, and I usually do this with Jupiter, is to fill in the background, make the background jet black. So here again, I'll go to this magic wand tool and outline the limb. And this time, I will contract it. to bring it off of the limb. I don't want it close to the limb. So about 2 pixels is enough to get it away from the limb. And then edit, fill, go down to the fill function here. And this will fill the background with the background color, which I have set to black. And then you can just deselect. Really, the last thing to do is just adjust the levels. The brightest parts of the image are already approaching saturation, but not quite. So we can move this down. Think about 245, just so we don't saturate the brightest elements in the picture. See, this is starting to get bright here. And then I like to pull this middle slider down just to give it a little more contrast there. So about 80, 85. So now that's the basically the finished image. To compare with where we started. There's where we started, and there's where I finished. Now, sometimes when the planet's pretty big here, when it's 48 arc seconds, and you don't have to do this, but sometimes I actually reduce the size of the image for when I post it. And that's what I did here. You can see this. This is about 80% of the size of the original image here that I used for the online post. And another thing, when you do that, it actually enhances it a little bit, I think. It's a little better when it's a little smaller, but obviously you don't want to take that to excess. So that's basically what I have to say. And if you gentlemen have any questions, I would be glad to try to answer them. We can go back to any point, I think, in the presentation.
I have a suggestion that might facilitate questions. Why don't we go back to kind of like each of the major points here? Like if you bring up, for example, your Autostakkert interface, and we can ask if people have any questions about your use of Autostakkert.
Absolutely. Yep. I must have closed it out by accident. Let me bring it up again. Okay. Here we are.
So now one question that I had is, when you're doing the stacking, is there a way that you're doing this kind of like in a batch fashion? We had a seminar last month with Lucky Stack Worker where stacking and sharpening was done in a batch mode. Or is there a capability here so that you can produce and instead of tediously going through each image?
Oh yes, I load the entire session in here at once. Like if I was doing this, I would start here and you just load every one of them in there. And so whatever settings I put, it does to everything.
So that's cool. So you basically take the entire imaging run, you can multi-select the entire thing and apply your settings run for each of them. Does that go into subfolders then so that you can see?
Yes, it does.
Okay. And then how do you do the comparison? You showed us how one later on in the session was not nearly as clear. How do you do that comparison, Gary? Do you just use Windows Explorer and look at them that way, or?
Oh, I use Photoshop, and I go into those subfolders. See, I have the subfolder saved here. I put all this in one folder for this presentation. So normally it'd be in my daily my daily work folder or my session work folder.
Right.
So yeah, then you can just open the folder here, and the raw image is here, and then the one that's sharpened has underscore CONV. Okay. And so I just, for instance, open all the red images together. I won't do them all here, but just to give you an idea. And I'll load all of the ones that I prepared and compare them. Now, I think you can tell number 2 here is a little sharper than number 3, but they're all good. Like I said, about 20 minutes later in the session, like I showed you before, the scene worsened. But that's the way I do it. I just open all the reds and then all the
Yeah.
greens and all the blues, and I try to identify a sequence of images, like I said, over maybe 10 or
Right.
even up to half an hour,
Right.
and
Right.
identify the sharpest images.
Cool. Hey, Joe, come off mute and ask your question.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. I know this is all equipment dependent and location dependent, but 3 years ago, I was looking at how long the subs should be, and the general guidance was that if you have a smaller scope, you can run it longer before you get into trouble with derotation. I was using a C14 and a 2-time focal extender. And even with the C14, which is larger than your 10-inch,
Right.
I couldn't see any degradation going up to 2-minute subs. So I'm wondering, you're using 60-second subs. I'm wondering how you settled on that. When I have longer subs, I have more images, and then I can select. I can cut more. I can be more selective on the fraction of the image that I take, and so I find I usually took between 5 and 10% of my images, not the 30 to 50.
Mm-hmm. That's very true. I used to use longer capture times as well. I've sort of gone back to this because I really have found that I don't see much difference. Now, you could, the longer the capture time and if the seeing is stable, then you certainly could stack more images. Like you said, you picked 10 or 15%, but you could still pick 30%, say, and you'd have more images even than I have in these stacks. And there's certainly nothing wrong with that. That's the more images, the better. That's your best defense against noise.
Yeah, I think one of the advantages possibly, Gary, of doing the 60-second would be that, you if you get into a situation where the seeing goes bad, it's not going to contaminate the 60-second ones. In other words, I think you might, just like with lucky imaging, that the faster the rate, the better chance of getting some stable seeing. So,
that's
but I think that it's either one I think would probably be fine. I've read too that you just don't want to go over 2 minutes.
Yeah, 2 minutes certainly would be the limit, I think, especially with a C14.
Yeah,
I had meant to make that very point. There's another way to do this is like to take a sequence of red filtered images and then a sequence of greens and then a sequence of blues. But if your seeing is like 9 and it's usually not super stable over a long session, then I think taking the individual RGB sets is an advantage, because it was several nights ago I had a situation where the seeing was kind of mediocre and I decided to go ahead and image anyway. And when I was looking through my sharpened stacks later on, I had one set out of the blue where the air settled down that was much better than any of the others. And so on that particular night, I just used a single RGB set. I didn't derotate a bunch of images. And you know, that way I was able to get a pretty decent image on a night that otherwise might have been a failure.
Awesome. James Dawson, why don't you take yourself off mute and ask your question?
Thank you, Gary. That was a great talk. When you use the sharpen function in Autostakkert, are you simply looking at those images to work out which runs are going to be good?
That's
You're
correct.
not processing those stacked.
No, I do not use those sharpened images from Autostakkert in the processing. I go back and I rerun the videos I've identified that resulted in the sharpest images after I decide how many total frames I want in the stack. And then I take those into Registax and apply wavelets. That's a much more flexible tool than using those sharpened images from Autostakkert. You can blend in some of the raw, you know, if it looks too sharp. But really the best way to do it is use wavelets.
Thank you.
All right. Let me see.
By the way, let me just say one more thing. I often do the methane band imaging, and that's sort of a quick and dirty image, and I actually do use those sharpened stacks on the methane band images.
We'll have to have you back to talk about your methane imaging. All right, you want to bring back up Autostakkert and let people take a look at that in case that triggers their thought process on anything else to ask about Autostakkert and its usage.
Keeps wanting to disappear on me. Oh, there it is. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, so this noise robust thing here is it's kind of a black box. The normal range is something like 3 to 6, and I usually set it sort of towards the upper limit. And of course, analyze, do the analysis first, and that's going to give you a graph. And then I don't use a whole lot of alignment points. Let's say here I'm going to use an AP size of 136, and that gives me about 27 points that nicely covers the image. And so that's about it. If there's some questions from anyone, I'd be glad to attempt to.
And your normalized stack is set at what, 80% there?
Yes, it is. You want to leave room in that histogram. You don't want to jam it all up, because the sharpening filters actually concentrate, tend to saturate the brightest areas. And so you want to have room. You want to have room on your histogram there. So yeah, I guess I never set this greater than 80%.
Gotcha.
Set it something like 70% because of the bright polar areas and so forth. You don't want to get those up near the saturation point at this point.
Okay. Hey, Greg Shanos, you want to come off mute and ask your question?
Yeah, I have a couple. Why do you use default on the Registax wavelets? I find every YouTube tutorial I've seen uses Gaussian, and I use Gaussian. I think that's a lot better. But and then have you ever tried Astrosurface? That's a new one out there. Do you have any experience with that?
No, none at all, I'm afraid. No, I've.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
I've tried it. It's pretty good, but I still kind of like Autostakkert and Registax.
What was the first part of your question again?
Oh, the default, the wavelets. I see everyone uses Gaussian. Every tutorial I've seen, even Crisco, that you use default, and
I use Gaussian when I do Mars.
Oh, okay. I was just curious.
Getting back to the Damian Peaches tutorials,
yeah,
he recommends using what I use. Now And I found that it works well on Jupiter.
Oh, okay.
Like you,
I'll try
I use
I'll
the
try it next time.
Yeah, give it a
Thanks.
try and see, you know. And if
Yeah, I will. I'll give it
doing
a
what you're
try.
doing, sure. Hmm. Absolutely.
All right, thank you.
There's more than one way to do this, and you know,
Oh,
Oh, I know.
just kind of
absolutely.
showing what I've been doing for the past couple of years.
Joe, did you have a subsequent question you want to ask Gary?
Yeah. So Gary, why don't you pull up that Autostakkert screen you had up a second ago? Because I noticed something that may be of use to other people, if you don't mind.
There we go.
Yeah, so take a look at the very bottom of that image. There's a little piece of Jupiter that's not covered by the selection. When I do as you do, afterward I take a look and then manually will put something in if an area isn't covered.
Yeah, exactly. You can just pop another one in. Probably should have done that. Just didn't think about it.
I've occasionally gotten artifacts, less so with Jupiter because there's a lot of detail, but more so with Venus where there's very little detail, if any. I often get artifacts where there's an edge to these squares. Do you ever see that as well?
You know, I haven't seen that with so much with Jupiter. Or Mars. I went through a period where I was getting that with Saturn. I don't image Saturn very often, but something funny was going on with Saturn, and it didn't like to do that. So, and I would get some jagged, sharp edges around there.
Yeah, I've also seen that, been frustrated that when I've been doing Venusian surface imaging in the infrared. Even before you're at this stage, may I ask when you mentioned you're using 10 millisecond exposures?
Yes.
May I ask what you usually aim for when you set the gain? I know for something like Jupiter, I usually will try to run as fast as my DAQ can run without dropping frames.
Mm-hmm.
And then I try to set my histograms separately for each color to around 80% or so for Jupiter, usually a little bit lower for Saturn. Mars, I can run at 3 or 4 milliseconds. How do you set your histograms?
Basically, just like you did, except I'm on purpose. I'm choosing a longer exposure time. A couple of the well-known Australian observers, McNeil and Anthony Wesley, have pointed out that they've done some experimentation with this, and they feel like that a longer exposure time is better. And they recommend something around 13 milliseconds with a C14 or a 16-inch. You know, I don't know. I haven't done similar experiments myself. This camera I have is very sensitive, and even with my exposure set at 10 milliseconds, the gain is only about 10%. It's an extremely sensitive camera, especially in the infrared.
The Starvis 2?
Excuse me?
It's a Starvis 2 sensor?
I believe that is the name of the sensor. Mm-hmm. It's the QHY 200M camera. I think it is a Starvis sensor. It's not a Sony sensor.
Well, Starvis 2 is it's a second generation Sony sensor.
I see. Mm-hmm.
And the reason it's so sensitive, particularly in the infrared, is that the light absorbing layer is thicker.
Mm-hmm.
And like Starvis 1, it's back illuminated, so there are no traces in the way. So that's the magic in the sensor. I usually remove the protective window from my cameras. On yours, the QHY, that's relatively easy to do, but I do it on my ZWO and what's the other company? Having a senior moment. But do you remove those windows at all?
No, no, I just leave it the way it comes from the factory. Well, why do you remove the window?
Well, I started to do that in particular when you have very bright areas next to very dark areas. Uh, and I became aware of this, for example, when I was night side imaging the surface of Venus, and you have the day side blazing. There, what I encourage everybody to do, just for fun, is to take your sensors, go to a relatively bright star, Betelgeuse or Sirius, Capella. It's not really important which one you use. Focus, and then crank the exposure and the gain way up. And you will discover all of the diffraction artifacts and all of the internal reflection artifacts that that your camera has. There are double bounce reflections from the surface of the sensor up to any flat surface and back down.
Mhm.
And the protective window definitely is producing unfocused ghost images, which, unless you go through the exercise that I described, you really don't see directly, but they affect the contrast of the image. Something like this, if you're doing something that's very, very demanding, like the surface of imaging the night side surface of Venus through the clouds, you absolutely have to do that. Another very challenging kind of image would be if you're trying to capture Phobos and Deimos next to Mars, which is blazing. Then those ghost images are problematic. In the deep sky imaging community, which tends to be different from the planetary imaging community, they will often use filters and do RGB or oxygen, sulfur, H-alpha imaging. And they talk about some filters having halos. What I've understood from doing the experiment that I described to you really is that I've never seen any description of or understanding on their community of why those halos are appearing. That's light that comes from their stars, bounces off their sensor, bounces off their filter, and then bounces back in. And so it's a defocused image. It lands right on top of the star. And so some stars appear to have halos. And that's what's going on.
Mm.
My experience is that I just don't need that protective layer. It means that I have to pay a little bit more attention to cleanliness. It means I will probably need to clean my sensors a little bit more than someone who doesn't. Because the protective window will also get dirty, and you'll see the donuts, the images of the dust on the protective window.
Yep.
But that's why I take it off. If you go through that exercise, you will also see, and this is actually rather interesting, diffraction artifacts coming off the rectilinear pixels of your sensor. And so you can see this rectilinear diffraction pattern. And it would not be appropriate for just the kind of imaging you're discussing, but for people who are doing the night side imaging, where artifacts from that blazing side of Venus is important.
Mhm.
Some of us who are not faint of heart, I'm still faint of heart, there is a clear protective cover bonded right onto the sensors. And some of the people in that community have successfully removed it. And it's not for the faint of heart. And the people who do that say, oh, I messed up and I destroyed my sensor. But then they do get spectacular images. And there's no question that there's an artifact that's coming from light bouncing off the pixels, hitting the front of that protective window and bouncing right back in. And we have gone to shorter focal length, a smaller F number optical systems, which tend to move the first diffraction images way off. Anyway,
we're heading up to 4 o'clock, so let's see if there are any other questions. I know one quick one I had, Gary, when you're working with WinJupos and you're trying to outline Jupiter,
Yes.
Are you using that F11 function, or do you do that manually? Do you not trust the F11 function?
I do it manually. That's right.
And have you found that the F11 is not giving you a good result, or is that why you do it manually?
No, sometimes it works fine, but you just have to check it. Yeah.
Now, I saw a comment in the chat window here that sometimes folks use the moons to help with that if there is a moon nearby. Is that another?
Very helpful.
Gotcha.
Because if there's a moon out here, there'll be a little circle. And that really helps you get the rotation correct.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yep.
One other thing I did want to comment on, we saw you using Topaz, and I know you and I have discussed this. The current iterations of Topaz, unfortunately, if you have that, you will see that Gary has a much, much different interface, which gives him a lot more control in terms of the denoising or sharpening. And the current ones are so AI driven. I think in general, the recommendation is not to use Topaz on your planetary images. I don't know if any others out there on our call today have comments or feedback on that, but I just would say be very careful about that. Yeah, Joe.
Yeah, so I have messed with Topaz, and I have called them up and discussed the AI and tried to encourage them. The reason it doesn't work so well is that they tend to train the sharpen on faces and the kinds of terrestrial images that people just take. And they have never gone to the trouble to train, for example, on Hubble or James Webb images of the planets, which would then allow the AI to learn how to sharpen correctly for planets. And so that it works. Sort of.
I've had more luck
with Noiser than I've had with their sharpener.
Yeah, you have to be careful. Alrighty, we're at the top of the hour again. I just want to, Gary, if you would stop sharing for a moment, I'm going to take back over.
There you go.
Thank you, sir. Let's see if I can find what I'm looking for. Alrighty. So just to kind of wrap things up here. So again, I especially want to acknowledge, as Gary has, Damian Peach's tutorials. I've done some of these myself. Again, I really recommend them, and you can go to his Patreon link there to sign up. Some of them are free, some of them you pay for, but I think it's well worth the investment. He's obviously a top tier amateur astronomy imager. Again, I'll be sending out the survey, would appreciate your feedback. Is this worthwhile what we're doing? Would you like to see certain other topics? It's your chance to give some feedback. Our next webinar is going to be on March 22nd. It's going to be talking about imaging during the daytime. And we're going to have like a panel discussion with Gregory Shanos and Frank Malello. So you can sign up on the website for that, which will be, again, March 22nd. And then finally, a really big thank you to Gary for this effort and for sharing your knowledge with us, for taking the time to put that all together and doing it in such a really good, fluid fashion. This was, I think, a great presentation. So again, Gary, our thanks to you.
Well, thank all of you very much. I enjoyed your comments.
All righty. Thank you guys very much. Appreciate everybody attending, and hopefully you found this useful. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
We're all gonna
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.